Welcome back for the final session of this symposium. So before I introduce the next speaker, I guess this is an appropriate time for me to say a few things that need to be said. First of all, I'd like to thank very much the rest of the program committee. So the program for this was set up by a committee of 4 people, and I'd like to especially recognize Tom Applequist, Michael Chanowitz, and Joel Premack, who are all actually former SLAC theory alumni who helped to create this program. So let's please give them a round of applause. So the last session will go outside of technical high-energy physics and explore some of the other realms that Sid was involved in. I like the slide that Bob Jaffe showed that showed how science somehow comes first, and by going out of science, you can achieve good understanding. And I think that also is some analogy for the way that Sid dealt with all of his responsibilities in the world, in administration, in advising the government, advising the military, etc. It's not always so easy to play those roles. Famously, Sid had on his desk a little sign that said, "There is only so much stupidity that one man can prevent." But that actually is a segue into a piece of poetry that when I read it, I said, this is immediately associated with Sid. This is William Butler Yeats' epitaph for Jonathan Swift. And I think the analogy is very strong. The poem ends, "Imitate him if you dare, world-besotted traveler, he served human liberty." So thank you. I now introduce the next speaker. This is Raymond Jeanloz. He's a professor at UC Berkeley of geophysics. He's one of the experts on matter at extremely high pressure created with diamond anvil cells and how that affects the structure of the Earth. He's also a longtime Jason and has worked with Sid on the military advising and nuclear weapons policy for a long time. And he's going to discuss that aspect of Sid's profile.
Thank you very much. In fact, the title that was assigned to me, Physics of Nuclear Weapons, you'll see is not exactly appropriate, so I will modify that in a few moments. As you know, Sid was an advisor to presidents of the United States and elsewhere. He was a close friend with a number of important and influential people, and you'll hear about the relationship with Sakharov in the next talk. But this all goes back to Pief Panofsky. We've talked about Sid as a mentor, but in fact, Sid had his own mentors. I think someone described briefly the relationship with Vicky Weisskopf, but clearly Pief was both colleague and mentor at the same time. Pief had the experience of the Manhattan Project and as a result was plugged into the advisory system well before Sid was, and actually helped Sid enter into government advising. I think Sid also, based on what he told me and others, had a huge amount of regard for Pief intellectually, but also I'll say morally, ethically. For example, we're all aware that Pief left my own campus, University of California, because of the loyalty oath issues in 1950, and that was quite important to Sid to be thinking about the ethical context of our work. So in fact, what I'm going to talk about today is physics-based policy for nuclear weapons. In some sense, I don't think Sid was all that interested in the physics of nuclear weapons per se, except to the degree that the scientific approach could help inform policy and broader societal issues. And I'm going to touch on 3 topics that are listed here. Hopefully I can do this quickly enough to get us through the talk. So let's start right away with the first one, which is stockpile stewardship. I'll explain what that means in a moment, and the nuclear explosion ban. And as Michael already mentioned, Sid was involved with the Jason Group, academic, independent advisors to the government in any and all areas, but especially in national defense and security areas. And Sid was quite involved, really as a founding father. He talked about a phone call he got from my colleague Charlie Towns, well before I was at Berkeley. In 1960, Sid didn't know Charlie at the time, but knew him by reputation, had enormous regard for Charlie, and he therefore took the call and answered to the request that he participate in a first experiment at establishing a new generation of independent technical experts post-Manhattan Project who could help advise the US government. At the time, Sid was already getting drawn into, for example, PCAS, or PSAC, the President's Scientific Advisory Committee. Another comment I want to make sure I articulated, another point, is is embodied in this quote from Sid, where the focus in any of these efforts in the policy-oriented arena, just as in science, was to think about the people, and especially bringing in a new generation. So right from the start, he was thinking about himself as being mentored, but also how one would mentor new people to come into the scientific advising enterprise. Arguably, the most important study or set of studies that Sid led in the Jason Group was some 34 years later, which were studies that were involved with so-called science-based stockpile stewardship. So this is stewardship, in quotes, of the US nuclear weapons stockpile. That's really the point. And the objective was to provide a technical basis for the United States adopting the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Well, at the time, the hope was for ratification, of course, and that has not happened yet. So Sid chaired these two studies and others. These were the first in making this case, well, really first, I should say, in addressing whether we, the United States, could afford to stop nuclear explosion testing, which really, especially for us experimentalists, amounts to, can we afford to stop exploring the boundary of nuclear weapons physics? Have we reached enough in terms of the weapons? And if you look at the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Article 1 really is quite striking in what it says, not to carry out any nuclear weapons test explosions or any other nuclear explosion whatsoever. That's reiterated. So that was really the technical challenge that Sid was trying to address. Now, I'll fast forward a little bit, and I've been involved in some of these efforts and in reviewing how well they're doing. Stockpile stewardship was stood up as a program for the United States in the mid-1990s. So now, 20 plus years later, we can look back retrospectively and ask, how successful has it been? Are we somehow undermining our own defense, we the United States? And this is something that has to be addressed very broadly for a wide range of communities, military, political, and others, right and left part of the political spectrum, hawks and doves. We really have to step back and ask, technically, are we somehow undermining our capabilities? And what I will say is that in retrospect, we can point to every year since the mid-1990s, the US nuclear weapons arsenal, the stockpile, is assessed for its capabilities, and in fact the capabilities of the whole complex, of the scientists, of the production, and so on. And so far every year it's passed muster, so to speak. It's kind of an interesting exercise because it involves technical experts from the laboratories, but also the military, who are in a sense the customers, the people who count on this capability, and there are independent outsiders who help to vet that system. Life extension programs refers to, sometimes the word modernization is used. That is when weapons that have been in the arsenal for a certain amount of time, typically decades rather than years, are refurbished in one way or another. And there have been successful refurbishment programs. For any who are interested, I can go into more detail and elaborate. A lot of interest in the details and what do we really mean by this. I will say that from my point of view, the term modernization is really not appropriate, but we can talk about that separately. Technical capabilities for making parts of the nuclear components, and as I said, maintaining some core capabilities. So I want to say at the outset, and I think I'm just about channeling Sid Drell in saying this, regardless of the size of the arsenal, or even hypothetically if we had no arsenal. Hypothetically, if we had no nuclear arsenal, even more so, we need this expertise. The expertise in the laboratories is what informs arms control, inspections around the world, the intelligence community being able to assess what a terrorist can do or a government. So I want to decouple, what one's views are about nuclear war, nuclear deterrence, hugely important and admittedly very emotional topics, and as they should be on the one hand, versus some of the technical capabilities. And I think Sid was quite passionate in making sure that we maintain the technical capabilities. And again, I'm just exaggerating a tiny bit by saying hypothetically, were we to have no nuclear arsenal, it's especially under those circumstances that we have to have these capabilities. There have been a number of reviews, including by the National Academy of Sciences. So remember, Sid's reports were in the mid-1990s, 94, 95. Within a few years, there was a request to assess the stockpile stewardship program and the ability of the United States to sign on to a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. This was shortly after the Senate failed to support ratification. And then about 10 years later, there was a reassessment. I'll come back in a moment as to why the two reports were needed. So both reports had the objective of assessing the United States' ability to maintain this capability so that our signing on to a treaty was not, in some sense, at the expense of making a bunch of other decisions about deterrence and defense and other issues that, quite frankly, are technical in content to some degree, but ultimately are political decisions and are dependent on how we vote and who we vote for. Also, for such a treaty, a nuclear test ban treaty, the country is interested in knowing how well might we be able to monitor and hence verify such a treaty. And then we might want to ask or document from a technical point of view, who cares? Why do we even bother to sign on to a treaty? Does it really have any hope in containing proliferation of nuclear technologies and knowledge? In 2000, so just a few years into the stockpile stewardship program and before the international monitoring system had been stood up for monitoring globally nuclear explosion tests, so before all of that capability was well tested and so on, the first study said, yes, the plan looks very good, looks quite adequate. The international monitoring system looks like it's getting stood up with good plans. The stockpile stewardship in the first few years, the annual assessments looked like they were working okay. But not unreasonably, the question was asked nearly 10 years later, really, how are we doing? Now that most of that monitoring capability has been stood up around the world, is it actually working? Now that stockpile stewardship has been in place for 15 years, not just for 3 to 4 years, is it still working? And what I'll say, this is now in my words, my summary, actually the capabilities turned out to be better than had been anticipated on both counts, all right? So I'll touch very briefly to give you an idea of the kind of approaches that are used for monitoring. This is an area that overlaps with my own field of geophysics. For example, seismology, monitoring the acoustic signals that get propagated through the earth and through the water and actually through the atmosphere when there's an explosion. The acoustic sensing around the world is actually quite good. The official international monitoring system has 50 primary stations, another 120, so under 200 stations totally that give a backbone of reliability that, well, if you look at the colors up here, these are in seismic magnitudes. What you want to translate to is basically we can monitor tests globally with this capability down to a few tens of ton kind of explosions, which is actually quite remarkable. Okay, so this is actually more detailed. 90% probability that 3 stations out of not 50 or 170, but out of only 41 will catch these events and so on. So this has been independently documented. Now, the 3 topics I chose them partly because they're in the news now or prospectively in the near future. And of course, this has been in the news because of the recent events, last several years' events in North Korea. An explosion at the North Korean nuclear test site lights up the seismic arrays all across South Korea, and not shown here, but also all across China, let alone all around the world. Here's a listing of the various explosions that they've had, from relatively small ones at a 0.5 kiloton up to the recent one, which is enormous, 250 kilotons, a quarter of a megaton. And this is a rough estimate. It may actually be a little bit low. This is actually a huge explosion, larger than had been seen in many decades. So there's seismic monitoring, but in the modern world, we have many other technologies available to us. Satellite reconnaissance, for example, has been revolutionized. Space used to be owned by nations, large nations, not anymore. Digital globe and other commercial satellite capability allow one to get imagery of the nuclear test site and actually to monitor what kind of preparations are being done. And there are groups, non-governmental organizations, even individuals who use a credit card and buy up such imagery. So I won't go into the details. I just want to impress you on the sophistication that is brought about by these technologies. For instance, by measuring the waveforms, so at each seismic station there's a three-dimensional measurement as a function of time of the ground displacements or the velocity or the acceleration. By monitoring and simulating those, one can determine the nature of the displacements around the source. Was it an earthquake, which involves shear displacements? Was it an explosion? Was it an implosion? So there's a tensor description of the source region, and one can invert these seismic signatures to determine this is one of those tests. This is the 2016 test, and sure enough, with very high probability, this happened to be an explosion. Very little earthquake-like character, although there's a little bit of earthquake character. This is a whole, I was about to say cottage industry, kind of a minor industry that's involved with very real-world applications. You may remember a few years ago there were some mine collapses in Utah, and the seismologists can tell the difference between a cavity imploding versus two walls coming together this way or that way. And you may even remember that at the time the owner of the mine said it was an earthquake. No, 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 no. It was two walls coming together this way, not that way. They had overmined, and unfortunately the miners died, and in a second event the inspectors that went down died in a second event. Okay, so you get the idea. There's a lot of incentive for this kind of capability. But it's more than that, because in fact there are, let's see if I've got it here, thousands of stations. Most seismologists are studying earthquakes, not explosions. Thousands of stations. This is the 1,000 stations of the Chinese Earthquake Administration. I showed you some of the Korean ones. And so in fact, when we say globally there's an international monitoring system that monitors down to tens of tons or 50 tons or something like that, in reality the capability among academics and specialists, this is actually another small event that was found near the test site. I think it's an earthquake, but it's a debate in the academic literature. But look at the size here. The academic researchers are arguing about half a ton. This is a small truck bomb. They're arguing about exactly what kind of event it was. I'm not saying it's solved, but we have incredible, exquisite sensitivity. That's the basic idea. So I didn't want to dwell on this too much, but just to give you a little bit of flavor of the science that's involved here. I'm now going to turn to a quite different topic, but really one of Sid's great passions, which was the world without nuclear weapons, and was labeled a joint enterprise in a way that I think has been underappreciated. This is a so-called Gang of Four, very famous editorial or commentary that was published in the Wall Street Journal in 2007, co-authored by George Shultz, Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn. Well, where did this really come from? It came very explicitly from the return of George Shultz to the Stanford campus after he had served as Secretary of State, and he and Sid became close friends. They had crossed paths before, they knew each other a little bit, but they became very close friends. And between, let's say, the early 90s and into the 2000s, they talked about issues of nuclear weapons policy, nuclear weapons employment, nuclear war, very uncomfortable and disturbing topics. And as a result of this, on the anniversary really of the Reykjavik meeting at which Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev contemplated apparently getting rid of the nuclear arsenals of the then Soviet Union and the United States, they decided to put out an editorial. There was a meeting here. And actually it was followed by a number of editorials. I just put a few subsets here toward a nuclear-free world in 2008, deterrence, next steps in reducing nuclear risk. Well, this is the Gang of Four, and I want to make a point that you all know in this room. Sid was not only very savvy, but was savvy in his humility. Of course, he was a humble guy, but he knew that there was no value added to putting his name onto the Gang of Fours. He put it, These are the four names that the people, the general public will recognize: the Kissingers, the Schultzes, the Nunns, and the Perrys. We don't need a scientist to add on to that author list. But guess who, this is not my opinion, did the primary writing of these editorials, okay? Guess who? And is this kind of recognized in this nice book by Phil Taubman, The Partnership? The subtitle is The 5 Cold Warriors and Their Quest to Ban the Bomb. There really were 5 people involved. It really was a gang of 5. So the reason I say joint enterprise is because there's a big focus on the vision of the world free of nuclear weapons, but in a way that's misguided. The vision is only part of what's involved here. The joint enterprise actually involves not just a vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, but specific initiatives that would allow one to move forward in this direction. Without the actions, specific actions to make this possible, the vision will not be possible. And as they've put it, we need a vision to motivate nations or peoples to move in this direction on the one hand. But on the other hand, we need, I'll call them tactical, specific actions that can be taken. And these are all consistent with our own American moral goals and heritage, but also, I'd say, more globally. I want to impress on you how specific and how many of these steps there were. You're supposed to look at this and see very blurred. I can't read this. You're not supposed to be able to read it. There are 8 specific points that were made in the very first editorial and then elaborated subsequently in conferences and others. Here's some of the key words: increase warning time, reduce substantially the size, eliminate short-range nuclear weapons, initiating a bipartisan process, providing the highest possible standards, control of uranium enrichment, halting production of fissile material, resolve regional confrontations. Very specific steps that have to be taken. So when people talk about the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, that sounds grandiose and wonderful. It is, but really this is where the meat is and where all the hard work is, and Sid knew this very well. Now, Sid had been involved with these issues for a number of years. You may know that he co-authored a book with George Bundy, Admiral Crowe, in the early 90s. He worked over the years with Ambassador Jim Goodby. So a number of discussions on the sizes of nuclear arsenals, what's needed for deterrence, how we can reduce those arsenals. He also, by the way, worked closely with religious leaders, Brian Hare, for example, at Harvard, and evangelical leaders. And you can ask, well, how successful was this? And all I can say is empirically, well, this is from a paper in the early 90s where they were projecting major reductions. Actually, the START II treaty never came into existence. But in fact, you know, the arsenals kind of have gone down by a huge amount. So there's been success there. More than that, this is a topic very much in the news now. Of course, there was a Prague speech of Obama's, President Obama's, in 2009. But just in the last few months, whether it was the United Nations nuclear weapon ban treaty that has now been signed onto by 120 nations, the Nobel Peace Prize, or just earlier this week, the Pope reiterating, calling once again for a ban on nuclear weapons. This is very much in the news. Where is this headed? I do not know. This is where now we're in the embraced by politics, and I don't know where we're headed exactly. I want to use this as a basis for turning to the last topic. This is what keeps me up at night with nightmares. And this is an area extremely arcane in which Sid was actually quite a leader and did some very important and I think under-recognized work. I'll just remind you that we've had history of very close calls. This is the hydrogen bomb that we dropped on North Carolina in 1961. All except one of the switches triggered to make it detonate. That one switch is what prevented a huge disaster, very well described in Eric Schlosser's book. Sid had over the years documented these so-called broken arrows and accidents. There are quite a few in the 50s. I guess the good news of this table is in the first decade of record, there were 19, the next decade 12, and the third decade only 1. This is the Damascus event down here. Again, if you read Schlosser's book or if you see the movie, that's highlighted there. And the Goldsboro event is the one that I was just referring to a moment ago. Very, very, very scary stuff. As a result of these and other events, Sid was called to chair a committee for the House Armed Services Committee. Oh, look at that. Charlie Towns once again shows up on this, and the other participant was Johnny Foster, former director of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. Johnny is still active, and I interviewed him for some of this background material. So just to say, they studied at great length what was going on with the safety of our own arsenal. I don't want to go into all of the details here. This is actually a summary of summaries. There were some significant issues, concerns about the safety of several nuclear weapon systems. This is 1990, including artillery-fired atomic projectiles deployed by US forces. Modernization is needed, and the past safety was not viewed with enough urgency. Specifically, safety and security. So safety of the weapon, that it not explode unintentionally in an accident, but also security, that it can't be taken over by someone who shouldn't have control of it. And use control should all be treated together. And so the US term of art is surety, which is this combination of safety and security. So the US developed policies and technologies. Some of them are somewhat sensitive, but many of them are remarkably openly discussed, actually. For example, we talk about accidents or possible accidents when weapons are in their normal environment. That might be when they're in storage or transportation under normal conditions. But there are accidents under unusual circumstances, and there are different probabilities. The safety switches and systems are supposed to prevent the possibility of a nuclear detonation, 1 part in 10 to the 9th for these normal environments, and 1 in 10 to the 6th. And then there's this very specific term called one-point safety. That means that if there's a nearby explosion next to a nuclear weapon, that explosion cannot trigger the nuclear detonation of the warhead with a part in the 6, 1 in a million chance, something like that. And there are specific technologies that are implemented for this. So let me contrast this with the news stories of the time of 1990. Okay, so a lot of what was going on in this congressional committee was, of course, very sensitive, closely held. But meanwhile, the news media were talking about defective nuclear shells, I can say based in Europe, were raising safety concerns. They were repaired secretly. Shells were being brought back. So here's the kind of nightmare scenario that specialists have to think about. What happens if these nuclear munitions are in a zone of conventional conflict, and now someone, I don't know, lobs a grenade or drops a bomb, a regular one, nearby an atomic weapon? Is it possible that that could trigger accidentally a nuclear detonation? And think about it. This is in the context of the Fulda Gap, of the Soviet troops coming into Germany and so on and so on. What if there was the initiation of a conventional war that then created a nuclear detonation? Now, what's going to happen? Who's at fault? Who knows who's responsible? Who caused the atomic detonation, and so on and so forth? So in this process, I just have a few more minutes. I want to say he once again built a very special relationship with a specialist at Sandia National Laboratory, Bob Purifoy, who is a bit of a hero in Schlosser's book and in the movie. They wrote an article for the Annual Review of Nuclear and Particle Science in 1994. It's entitled Technical Issues of a Nuclear Test Ban, but actually most of the article is about nuclear weapons safety. Okay? And Purifoy was one of the pioneers in developing the technologies for making the US nuclear weapons safer. The point is that it's horrible enough to ever think of using these in a military action, but even that much more inconceivable that they would accidentally detonate and cause havoc and damage, possibly in one of our urban areas. All right? These are the kinds of nightmares that one might have. And in fact, Bob Purifoy was involved with developing some of these technologies, which you can read about on the web, at Department of Defense websites, using so-called strong links, very specialized signals to arm a weapon, so-called weak links that would disarm a weapon if it's challenged. For example, if it encounters high temperatures, say, for instance, associated with a fire, this is supposed to actually disarm the weapon and make it impossible that it would actually detonate. So these kinds of technologies have been developed and actually applied. And so here I come to my last slide, which originally was blank, because I didn't really know what I could write here in good conscience. But let me just summarize. I had you imagine the Cold War scenario, US Army troops with nuclear munitions based in Germany or elsewhere in Europe, with the possibility that there'd be an onslaught of conventional weapons, tanks, for example, coming across the border, and the possibility of conventional explosions in a general area where there are atomic munitions. Well, we fixed the problem as far as we can tell in terms of the US arsenal. We have not very much deployed abroad in any case. But think about other parts of the world. And we're very uncomfortable about what other countries have done what to protect their own nuclear weapons. So this safety issue, or surety if you want, has a potential for a catastrophic event, by which I mean an accidental detonation. It could be on one of our own military bases at home or hypothetically abroad. It could be in transportation, as has almost happened a number of times in the past. So that's what I mean by catastrophic event. One single nuclear explosion that could be devastating if it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nuclear crisis is code language. It's a euphemism for nuclear war that gets initiated by accident, not because of some mistake of a missile that's been launched and misidentified. This is because a conventional munition has exploded near an unsafe weapon and caused it to detonate. Now neither side knows who's the person who detonated a nuclear weapon, okay? And whose fault is it, by the way? If it's someone else's conventional bomb that detonates my nuclear weapon, who's at fault here? And finally, these are exceptionally difficult topics to discuss. No one wants to talk about how their systems might be unsafe. And that's aside from some of the technology, some of the procedures quickly get kind of sensitive. But I'll tell you that increasingly we're not alone, a number of countries are trying to begin to discuss this around the world, because no matter how carefully we think we've done these things, we know that we haven't done the ultimate job. I'll leave you with one perhaps bad analogy. We know that one of our high-risk, high-tech systems was a space shuttle program. And you may know, if you look into the literature, that it was estimated by the managers that there was a 1 in 100,000 chance that the space shuttle would have an accident. And you know from the history, right, that it was a couple of space shuttles of the order of 100 flights that went down, that blew up. So we know that we were off by orders of magnitude in the safety estimates for that kind of a system. And this, I think, is really one of the things that kept Sid awake and concerned, was to think about these technologies for the future. So again, I tried to touch on 3 topics very briefly to give you an illustration of Sid's passion, perhaps not so much for the physics of nuclear weapons, but for physics-based policy guidance for nuclear weapons. Thank you very much. Question? Very uncomfortable subject.
To what extent did your and Sid's expertise inform Secretary Moniz in his discussions in regard to the Iran controls?
Well, I'm sorry, with regards to Iran?
With regard to the Iran treaty.
The Iran negotiations did get some input from a wide number of experts. I must say, the system worked remarkably well from what I saw. I'll label myself as an outsider because I really want to give credit to the system. Secretary Moniz was able to and did very effectively tap our nuclear weapons laboratories. You're helping me make the point I tried to make earlier. Why, even if you hate nuclear weapons, you want to get rid of them, what have you, you don't want to get rid of that capability, because actually they were absolutely essential to making criteria, presenting criteria and offering alternatives, technologies, as well as ways, policies and ways to think about those technologies for deciding what's good enough to be able to make a treaty verifiable process for Iran. What are the kinds of procedures? What are the technologies? Huge amount of support. There were outsiders like ourselves, but I do want to give a lot of credit for those working in government and directly in government, including one of our colleagues here at Stanford these days, Jim Timby, who retired from the State Department as a physics PhD from this organization, and then spending most of his, essentially all of his career at the State Department. I think over here. There you go.
This is a question that let's ignore, say, who happens to be the President of the United States.
Yeah.
This is a question really about the fact that your talk and all of the work that you and Sid and others have done is based on a fundamental respect for science. And how do you feel about whether the country as a whole does still maintain that respect?
Yeah. So that question bears on many issues, from climate change and energy policy to these kinds of very difficult issues. And I'm sorry, but this is an easy audience to ask that question. Of course, we're all passionate about making sure that the facts, as best established, become the foundation for a discussion. I will say, as a scientist, and I talked with Sid. I mean, we worked together for a few decades, and we talked about this many times. I think Sid very much shared, at least my view is, science is the starting point for the discussions. Most of the decisions that we're talking about are ultimately political, and we have to acknowledge that and respect that. We have to have a little bit of humility as scientists. So I've always viewed science and technology and engineering as kind of the starting point for discussion. You lay that foundation, and then ultimately one has to acknowledge that the political decision might not be what one had hoped for. Sid had that experience, certainly I did, and I have found myself even respecting politicians who will turn to me and say, I hear what you said, I understand it, but here's why I'm going to vote differently. As long as they can explain to me that they're doing something that's not irrational or something like that. So these are political and in some cases hugely emotional and troubling issues. And in the end, I don't think they are relegated just to science, but we sure want to make sure that the science and engineering behind the discussions is really, really solid. So it's very troubling these days when there are hints that science is really, that doesn't matter whatsoever. And it's not just this administration. This has happened many times. And I think actually in our country, you can see hints of that back to the revolution. Right? Although I'd be happy to be corrected by anyone with more historical knowledge.
Yep, so this is actually somewhat related to the last question. So I always really appreciated that Sid worked on this. I actually talked to him about some of this a long while back. But I guess I specifically wanted to ask about part two. You didn't really, you demurred from discussing where it's at, but of that gang of five, I think the four others are still alive. How, those specifically, are they still pushing this issue?
In varying ways, to varying degrees. Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, who's here at Stanford, is, first of all, he wrote a biography, basically, that features his view, the conclusion he's reached over his career, that there are good reasons for getting rid of nuclear weapons. And that's a longer discussion, but basically that the risks outweigh the benefits, however you see those. He's quite active. He's putting out YouTube material and so on and so forth. George Shultz is very engaged and is supporting trying to maintain a discussion. I'll just say this privately, I'm amazed, that at his age and with everything he's got on his plate, this is still an area that he's very passionate about and very involved. I've not been so engaged. I've only crossed paths with Henry Kissinger a few times in the last few years, and he is still part of the discussion. And then Sam Nunn, I just should acknowledge, is still involved with the Nuclear Threat Initiative, of which Ernie Moniz is now the president. And the mandate of that group is, among other things, to work towards a world free of nuclear weapons. So they've all been working in their own ways. I'm sure this is a prejudiced view, but Sid had a magical way of helping to coordinate a lot of those views and talents of those individuals and channeling them into those op-ed pieces that were very special. And also the conferences associated with them. Thank you. I'm going to set up the next speaker. Go ahead. I think we're good.
Okay, so the next speaker on the program is actually the only speaker without a physics PhD, but I'd like to very warmly welcome my Stanford colleague, David Holloway. He is a professor of history and political science here at Stanford. He's the author of the book Stalin and the Bomb, which is the definitive history of the Soviet nuclear program, many other writings on the history of the Cold War. And he's very graciously agreed to come here and talk to us about this special relationship between Sid Drell and Andrei Sakharov.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for a historian and political scientist to be listed as a speaker at a symposium on fundamental physics. But more seriously, it's a great honor to be here to talk about Sid Drell. I was very fortunate to work with him over a period of 30 years, mainly through CSAC, the Center for International Security and Arms Control, as it used to be called, beginning in the 80s, and then over the last 10 or more years, when he was active at the Hoover Institution, working with George Shultz on the project to create a world free of nuclear weapons that Raymond spoke about. We, of course, occasionally joked, as in any interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary community we have, about the relative benefits of our own disciplines, which I have to say, for a historian or a political scientist to do battle with a physicist on that score is rather difficult. But Sid would acknowledge that, I think he would quote Einstein to say, yes, the physics is the easy part, it's the politics that's difficult. And he added and wrote in various times, because then you're supping with the devil. So my topic is Sid's friendship with Andrei Sakharov, whom Sid greatly admired and more than once referred to as a saint. Sakharov was born in 1921, so he was 5 years older than Sid, and he died in 1989. I'm not going to go through his life, but I want to point to some stages of his life because this has a bearing on the relationship that Sid and Sakharov had. Sakharov was drawn into work on thermonuclear weapons by his mentor, Igor Tamm. And from 1950 to 1968, he lived at Arzamas 16, now called Sarov, the Soviet equivalent of Los Alamos. And he played a major role in the development of Soviet thermonuclear weapons. In 1968, he was removed from secret work after he had written an essay called Reflections on Progress, Peaceful Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom, which was published in the West. It was published in full in the New York Times. And in fact, I read somewhere that during 1968, 18 million copies of the essay were distributed around the world. And in the opening paragraph of that essay, Sakharov states that his views, the views he's going to express in this essay, are formed in the milieu of the scientific technical intelligentsia, which is very worried about the future of humankind. And the concern of the scientific intelligentsia, he writes, is all the stronger because what he called the scientific method of directing politics, economics, art, education, and military affairs had not yet become a reality. And he then goes on to explain what does he mean by the scientific method in this context. His answer is, we consider scientific that method which is based on a profound study of facts, theories, views, presupposing unprejudiced and open discussion, which is dispassionate in its conclusions. In other words, what he was really pushing for at this stage was the open and public discussion of serious issues facing the human race and facing the Soviet Union. And the two he discusses in that essay are the danger of nuclear war and also environmental degradation. And in the essay, he expresses ideas he had been coming to for some period, but the immediate trigger for his writing the essay was that he had sought permission from a member of the Politburo, Mikhail Suslov, who was a very conservative ideologist, but Sakharov had met him and he wrote him a letter on the issue of anti-ballistic missile systems. He asked that the letter be shown to Brezhnev, which it was, but he also asked for permission to publish an article about anti-ballistic missile systems. And the argument he made, and he said it was shared by other senior scientists at Artemis 16, was that creating ABM defenses against massed attacks is not realistic, while for individual missiles it is difficult but possible. But Suslov refused him permission, said, no, you can't write an article about that, publish an article on that. And I think that was, to Sakharov, really ran absolutely counter to his idea that these problems needed to be widely discussed. I don't think he meant, necessarily by everyone, but that there was specialist community, there were people who knew things, and the policy would be best formulated if it was open to public discussion with proper restrictions for secrecy and so on. He's not proposing that everything would be open. And I mentioned this episode, actually let me show the two men I'm talking about here, which is Stanford in 1989. I mentioned this episode because it shows that Sakharov, like Sid, as Raymond has very nicely explained, was interested not only in physics, but in the application of science to policy, something that Sid had been drawn into by Piv Panofsky beginning around 1960. And it was the publication of this essay, which, when you read it now, seems hardly revolutionary or radical, the Sakharov's essay, I mean, that meant that he would be excluded from secret work. And it's only after that that he begins gradually to move from a concern about a kind of science-based policy, if you like, to a concern about human rights. And Sakharov's ideas about human rights are encouraged when he meets Elena Bonner in 1970, and the two of them marry in 1972. And in 1975, Sakharov was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work for human rights. And the title he gives is Peace, Progress, and Human Rights. And if you compare that title with the title of the 1968 essay, you see that the new element here is human rights. And in his Nobel lecture, which he wasn't allowed to go to make, it was Elena Bonner who went to Oslo to receive the prize, he named over 100 political prisoners in the Soviet Union, and he also made the general point that peace, progress, and human rights were indissolubly linked. For progress to be beneficial and peace secure, human rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and so on, had to be protected. So there was a kind of link between the rights of the individual and the capacity of the human race to cope with the great challenges that it faced. For example, the danger of nuclear war or environmental degradation, which were the two he focused on in the 1968 essay. So that's, I give that background because this is the context in which Sid and Sakharov first meet. Sakharov in the early 70s, he had this great prestige. He was one of the few people who had been awarded the Hero of Socialist Labor 3 times. You know, he was, people in the political leadership knew how important he had been to the nuclear weapons program. And he used his position to try to help weaker members of society against repression if they spoke out in their views or criticized Soviet policy. And he was under a lot of pressure in the early 70s because the authorities were rounding up signatures from his colleagues in the Academy of Sciences to condemn him for what he was doing. Not everyone signed, but a great number of people did. And it was at this point that Sid and Sakharov met at a meeting and the meeting took place in Moscow at a small conference on composite nucleon structure. And Sid recalled that what I considered a great compliment to me, he apparently knew enough about me through whomever to sit down next to me at the meeting. And in his memoirs, Sakharov writes of Sid as a young man, already a very well-known physicist. And they exchanged notes at the meeting, but Sakharov didn't speak any English, or his English was very poor, and Sid's Russian was even poorer. So this communication was difficult. They could speak a little, each of them a little German, so that's how they talked. But nevertheless, they clearly struck up a rapport because Sakharov invited Sid, along with Vicky Weisskopf, to dinner at his apartment on Chkalov Street, Ulica Chkalova. And Elena Bonner was there, and Elena Bonner's daughter, Tanya Yankelevich, was there. And my guess is that she was the one who made conversation possible at the dinner table. So they formed a bond, and then they met. Sid came, obviously, was in Moscow for a short time, and then they met 2 years later in Tbilisi at an international high energy meeting. And Sakharov and Elena Bonner were there, and so they spent a week together. And I think, oh, sorry, that's, sorry, let me go back. I had mistimed. So this is a photograph of Sakharov and Igor Kurchatov in 1958. This is a point, and it's actually important in Sakharov's life, when he was trying to get the Soviet Union to stop atmospheric testing, and actually had some success for, I mean, there was helped to create the moratorium on testing from 58 through to 1961. But this is the photo from Tbilisi, from Georgia, in probably 1976. And it's, even if the photograph is a bit blurry, the jacket is clear enough that you know who's Sid. And that's Elena Bonner in the middle. So Sid maintained a very steady correspondence after he came back with Sakharov and with Bonner. The correspondence is in the Hoover archive, and I went through the files, and I was actually struck by how much correspondence, how consistent it was. A lot of the correspondence after this meeting, so in the late 1970s, had to do with the repression of human rights in the Soviet Union, how to make that known in the United States, how to generate support for scientists who were being repressed. So, for example, Sid contacted a number of people to get invitations to Sakharov to come to American universities to spend time. I mean, none of those were successful because the Soviet authorities took the view that Sakharov knew too much about Soviet nuclear weapons to be allowed to travel. Sid was also extremely helpful to Elena Bonner's children. I mentioned already Tanya Yankelevich and her husband Yefrem. And he did what he could to keep Sakharov's name and Sakharov's plight in the public mind. Helped to arrange publication for Sakharov's statements and for his papers. He organized conferences on Sakharov. He wrote letters to Congress, people in Congress. He wrote letters and mobilized his own scientific colleagues to keep the plight not only of Sakharov, but of other scientists who were being excluded from work or being repressed in different ways for their activities in defense of human rights, often at that time in defense of the Helsinki Final Act, which the Soviet Union had signed. The Helsinki Watch Group was set up in Moscow. Yuri Orlov, a physicist, was a key figure in that, and was sentenced to 7 years in the camps for his activity in pushing for human rights to be observed. Now, Sid wasn't alone in this. There were other people. There was an organization formed at Berkeley called SOS, Sakharov, Orlov, Sharansky. So I'm talking about Sid and not about the whole movement, but I was impressed by the number of letters, by the responses to journalists or people who wanted to know what the situation was like for Sakharov. And there's a very touching letter from Sakharov to Sid in June of 1981. So by this time, Sakharov is already exiled to Gorky. I'll come back to that point. Dear Sydney, I want to write to you this time not an open letter, but a most ordinary letter to thank you from the bottom of my heart. You, that's Jelena Bonner, and I feel all the time that in that infinitely distant world in which our children have been mislaid and where they now live, there are some, very few people who have not forgotten them or us, and you are one of them. And then, I think rather slyly, Sakharov adds, I sense that almost physically, seeing you in my mind's eye in your checked suit, although perhaps you now dress differently. So in the late 70s, Sid refused to go to the Soviet Union, and he wrote letters to people from whom he had received invitations. Bogolyubov was one. It's a very diplomatic letter saying how much he missed and regretted not being able to go to the conference. But in this case, given the way in which Yuri Orlov had been treated, he didn't feel he could do so. And he wanted to believe that before too long, normal scientific relations would be reestablished. Now, in 1982, Sid was invited. So in 1980, Andrei Sakharov was arrested in January for criticizing the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And he was sent into exile in the town of Gorky, now known as Nizhny Novgorod, which was closed to foreigners. So it's a kind of internal exile. Jelena Bonner was not initially exiled. She could travel between Gorky and Moscow. So in late 1982, Sid was invited by the Soviet authorities to go and have discussions with high-level government officials and military people about arms control. So this is a response to his arms control writings. And he wrote that he would go on one condition, that he could have a meeting with Jelena Bonner while he was in Moscow. And the Soviet authorities accepted that. And the American embassy arranged a meeting. And at the meeting, Sid gave to Jelena Bonner some articles he had written, some congressional testimony he had given to be given to Sakharov. And these statements from Sid prompted Sakharov to write one of his best-known writings, one of his most important papers on the danger of thermonuclear war, an open letter to Dr. Sidney Drell, which was published in Foreign Affairs in the summer of 1983. And the paper caused a great stir in particular because it intervened on a specific policy issue in the US over whether or not the heavy MX ICBM should be deployed. And Sakharov came to the conclusion that since the Soviet Union had heavy ICBMs, it really wasn't going to be possible to achieve any reduction unless the US also deployed a similar system, a system whose deployment SID had been opposed to and openly opposed to in one of the lectures given to Sakharov. So SID replied to Sakharov, pointing out the many areas of agreement between them, and then he defended his position on MX by noting that the silo-based system would be vulnerable to destruction in a first strike, Soviet first strike, and therefore was essentially itself a first strike weapon because it would have to be used first if it was going to be used at all. It couldn't be a retaliatory system. In his memoirs, Sakharov, the version of the memoirs I have, it has some additions in it. But so Sakharov writes, "I consider Drell a friend. For many years, Drell was an advisor to the US government on questions of nuclear policy and disarmament. In a series of articles and presentations in recent years, he has formulated his position on these questions. I fully share Drell's basic principled position, but I can't completely agree with those assertions relating to recent actions, to assessments of the existing military and political situation, to the ways of attaining the goal of all reasonable people of eliminating the danger of nuclear war." But then after SID's reply, he has an insertion in the memoirs saying that after reading SID's response, he thinks their differences are not so great after all, with kind of reconciliation. So SID kept up his activity through the 80s while Sakharov was in exile in Gorky. And I remember there was a visit by Elena Bonner during that period to here, and something very clear in my mind in the Drell's house, SID arranged for Joan Baez to come and sing for Elena Bonner, and she sang "Oh Freedom." It was a remarkably touching occasion. And then in early 1986, SID wrote to Mikhail Gorbachev, who some months earlier had become General Secretary, to say, now it's time to release Sakharov. Let him come back to Moscow. And Gorbachev did that 12 months later. So whether SID's letter had any effect on the decision may be doubted. But what I think is true is that the campaign over the years to keep Sakharov's plight in the public eye, to point out what a kind of Soviet patriot Sakharov had been, what a considerable scientist, how he was fighting for the improvement of the system. All of this played its role, I think, in the treatment he was given, which was not, he himself was not tortured, though some members of some relations were treated extremely badly. But in any event, Sakharov came back to Moscow, and SID met him in Moscow in June 1987, so the first time in 11 years. So it's their third meeting. But it's a friendship that's solid, not from the well, they'd had 2 meetings at conferences, but from the activity and the exchange of correspondence. SID, how am I for time? I'm sorry, I'm not good at 5. I might take 6. So SID often made the comment that if you met Sakharov, you would know he was an extraordinary person. And thanks to SID, I did have the chance to spend an evening with Sakharov in Moscow. And certainly my impression, I mean, I regarded him as a hero for the moral courage he showed First of all, for the ideals he was advocating, but also the great courage he showed in dealing with the attempt to repress him. And I certainly came away with the feeling that he was an extraordinary person. I mentioned just two characteristics. One was when he wasn't somebody who spoke very quickly, but if you asked him a question, and it's clear in my mind, I had this image at the time, that you would see him turning his mind to the question like a searchlight. You know, it would move, and then it was illuminated. It was remarkable. And the other thing, and this is a very maybe rather curious thing to say, but he had a clear sense of his own importance for Russia. He was actually very nice to me. I was writing a book about the early Soviet nuclear program, and I remember before I rang the bell, I thought, what on earth am I doing here? This man has much more important things to do. But actually, he was very charming and very happy to talk about, you know, for 2 or 3 hours about his own involvement. But it was very clear he knew how important a figure he was in Russian society and Soviet society, without the slightest trace of arrogance. And it came to my mind, I don't know where I knew this, that candidates for canonization in the Catholic Church, of course, humility is a virtue, but you also have to have an understanding of your own special position. So it combines a kind of sense of, yes, I am an important person, but in a way that's not my doing. It's, as it were, the grace of God. But I recognize that that's the case. Finally, well, not quite finally, but yes. In 1989, Sakharov came to Stanford. I think there was a physics conference. But the bit that I remember is that he gave a seminar at Galvez House, which is where the Arriaga building now is. And Galvez House was a funky little place where the SLAC was housed, and a small seminar room. He gave a seminar, and actually Harvey Lynch, who's here, took the photographs, the wonderful photographs. And actually, the only problem, I chose the wrong photographs because Yelena Bonner was with him. And the two of them gave a seminar about the political situation in the Soviet Union. And there had been elections in March, this was August 1989, to a new parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies, to which Sakharov had been elected and had become the center of kind of tumultuous debates in the parliament, and partly, I mean, one of them over his criticism of how the Soviet army was behaving in Afghanistan, and that, you know, the veterans came up and, you know, berated him and so on. But they gave this seminar pointing to three major issues: constitutional issue, the issue of nationalities in the Soviet Union, and the issue of property. Would you still have state property, socialist property, and so on? And it was actually an extraordinary situation. It wasn't a big conference room, but to, as it were, to have Sid and Sakharov and Yelena Bonner united there, talking in a period of great optimism about what was going on in the Soviet Union. I want to finish just by saying that I think that this was a genuine and close friendship, even though they didn't meet very often. They were in some ways alike. They were physicists, of course, similar views about nuclear weapons, but there were other similarities. They were both greatly interested in the implications of new technologies. But the thing that struck me most, when thinking about it, is that they both had an extremely strong sense of ethics and of integrity. It was important to think what was right in a given situation, but once you decided, then you should follow through, Even if other people thought you were just being stubborn, you should do that. Of course, the situations in which they found themselves were very different. Sakharov faced challenges that Sid, fortunately, did not face. But nevertheless, and Sid, of course, greatly admired Sakharov. He saw the heroism, the integrity as a kind of saint to it. I think he was drawn to that. And I think my sense is that Sakharov recognized similar quality in Sid. And I do want to finish by reading a poem by Boris Pasternak. And I'm sure there are Russian speakers in the audience, so you'll forgive me before I start my Russian accent, but I want to read it in Russian and then in English. And the link here is that this is a poem by Pasternak that he wrote in the mid-50s to himself as a poet, but Andrei Sakharov, in the obituary for his own mentor, Igor Tam, actually uses this poem as a way to organize what he wants to say about Tam. And I think, I hope, that when I read it, you will think, yes, this actually applies to Sid as well. I'm not reading, it's a short poem, but I won't read all of it. Будь знаменитым некрасиво, не это поднимает ввысь, не надо заводить архивы, над рукописями трястись. Цель творчества – самоотдача, а не шумиха, не успех. Позорно ничего не значит, будь притчей на устах у всех. Но надо жить без самозванства, так жить, чтобы в конце концов привлечь к себе любовь пространства, услышать будущего зов. И должен ни единой долькой не отступаться от лица, но быть живым, живым и только до конца. It's not becoming to be famous, for that is not what lifts us up. So do not build yourself an archive or pore over your manuscripts. To be creative, give of yourself. Don't seek sensation or success. It's shameful when you don't signify to be on everybody's lips. But live your life without imposture, and live it so that in the end you hear the summons of the future and draw love in from far and wide. And never for a single moment renounce your true self or pretend, but be alive, alive and only to the end. Thank you. Oh, questions, sorry. Okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. So the last speaker in the symposium is Lance Dixon. Lance came to SLAC as a postdoc in 1986, actually after one of these long SLAC theory interrogations, and became rapidly a recognized expert on string theory. But then in the early 90s, with Bern and Kossauer, switched his expertise to QCD. And actually, he is the author of many of these impossibly difficult conversations that you heard about, calculations rather, that you heard about in relation to jets at the LHC in the previous talk. At the same time, he's been a stalwart and a major figure in the SLAC theory group, and he's going to give a talk about the SLAC theory group under Sid's influence.
laser and light.
All right, thank you very much. It's a real honor, and I'm very humbled to go on after all of these esteemed scientists and historian and try to tell you a little bit about SLAC's theoretical physics tradition. But before we do, there's one person who hasn't been thanked yet. I would like to thank Michael for putting this whole thing together. His co-organizers have been thanked, but Michael did a yeoman's job in arranging this, and like to recognize that. So the influence that people have goes on for a long time, and I like to think about it in terms of, or I have an image of a mountain pond with dropping rocks in and seeing the ripples they make and going out, bouncing off the shores and stuff. And I think Sid really was a big rock. Not only that, but I also like this because it has a lot of quantum interference going on in it. And he was one of the rare people where you always had constructive interference. And so he was a real father figure for me and a kind of a mentor. And eventually I found myself even emulating his hairstyle as I got older, but not his choice of jackets. So you get some. And anyway, so let's proceed. This is not really going to be a physics talk because you've heard a lot of great physics already today, and the reception awaits. But I did want to talk about the fact that theoretical physics, and of course here I'm talking about theoretical high-energy physics. There's a lot of other theoretical physics done at SLAC. But in the high-energy physics group, it's already been mentioned by many of the other speakers. It took a lot of its character from Sid. And so I'm just going to kind of repackage some of the things that have been touched on already by many other speakers. And one of the key qualities was his openness and his idea that you should discuss things and not hold them back, and the science comes first. Also extremely important was the fact that he treated everyone equally and with great respect. Probably came from his humility despite his great science and service to the nation. And another important thing was no silos. He had a very ecumenical way of looking at science. He didn't want to be, and Roger Blanford wants me to say, stovepiped into any particular category, and he saw the virtue of thinking broadly about problems. And we've already heard about this a few times. The characteristic of asking questions, dumb questions, incisive questions, lots and lots of questions, led to very, very long seminars. And another important thing that he led by example was talking to experimenters. Of course, he helped found the lab by long discussions, presumably with Panofsky. And then there was a tradition of not only talking to the experimenters, but playing softball with them. We'll return to that later. At this point, I'd like to quote at length by something I saw that Inga Karliner wrote a year ago. And she was a graduate student at SLAC. She was originally a graduate student at Stanford, but her advisor passed away. And so she came under the wing of the SLAC theory group. And she talked about the fact that, well, I know other people have had this experience too, with him saying, "My name is Sid," if anyone tried to call him anything more formal than that. And she also talked about the openness of his office and how supportive the whole environment was, thanks to Sid's leadership. And then this is something that I think it ended by the time I got to SLAC in 1986, but he used to lead a graduate student seminar where he was the only PhD allowed in the room in order that the graduate students could give talks just supported by the other graduate students and by Sid's dumb questions and stuff. So I think she really benefited from this environment. And she, I believe, she mentioned that she was the only female physicist, at least that she knew at SLAC at the time, and that Sid would bring her over to the house to supply an existence proof for certain budding people who might want to become female physicists later. So Sid was an expert about silos, but we didn't talk about that. But anyway, his leadership and the nature of the group had a big influence on me, because when I was a graduate student, I was at Princeton, and this was after 1984 and the first string revolution, a hotbed of string theory, and everybody was working on that pretty much exclusively. And then I came to SLAC in 1986, and I discovered this much broader environment. Also, many more of the doors were open. People just wandered in and out and talking about different things. And so, you know, by 6 years later, I kept working on string theory, but I started to move in other directions, and I worked with Yossi Nir, now at the Weitzman, on neutrino issues, and also worked on skyrmions with Brian Warr and Yossi. And then I started to retool for perturbative QCD, and this was all sort of a consequence of this sort of lack of silos. But what I did was sort of much smaller than what other people who went through the SLAC theory group tended to do. We already heard in two beautiful talks earlier today about how theoretical physicists like Joel Premack and Alan Guth moved into cosmology, redefining the field. Also, there was Josh Freeman, who was a spokesperson, I think, for Dark Energy Survey, Bharat Ratra. And then there was accelerator physics. Sid himself wrote a paper with Dick Blankenbeckler on beam Strong. And BJ here wrote a paper on the theory of intrabeam scattering, which was incredibly influential. But that's still somewhat close to physics. But other people went on to become deans, college presidents, displaying skills that go way beyond the kinds of technical skills that you learn about in physics. And that includes Peter Lepage over here, Fred Gilman, and Tom Applequist, who's somewhere over here, and Adam Falk, who was president of Williams College. Also lab directors. And John Bagger is the director of Triumph. He came through. I don't know if John's still around. And also Chris Llewellyn-Smith, who directed that little laboratory in Geneva for a while. And then people went off into finance, of course, and one of them became the director of one of the best bond funds in the world, I'm told. And Sam Berman went to LBL and then moved into energy efficient lighting. And I'll now add Bob Jaffe in the same vein to moving into the physics of energy. So I think this no silo lesson really rubbed off on a lot of people as they moved on in their careers. Okay, now it's time to mention a few of SLAC theory's greatest hits. And this is a very dangerous undertaking because I can only mention a few. And every mixtape from the 80s or before had normal bias, you see. And so it's going to have my own personal bias and be totally incomplete. I left out a few talks that previous speakers might have covered, but I couldn't possibly leave out this paper, which was actually a pair of papers by BJ, which led to Bjorkane scaling and DIS. So this axis here is on the experimental data for deep inelastic scattering, in which Bjorkane basically told them how to plot it. The only mistake he made was using 1 over xbj instead of xbj, as far as I remember the history. But if you just invert that variable, that was literally the x-axis in 80% of Lucien's plots earlier today. And but more to the point, what he did was he gave some arguments based on current algebra that led directly to the way you wanted to view things in order to see as visually as possible the quarks appearing inside the proton. But this picture here, not exactly a close-up of BJ, but it shows him scaling. He's scaling the south face of Cathedral Peak. I stood on top of Cathedral Peak once, but I took the tourist route up, not the south face. So I'm pretty impressed by that feat as well as this one. You'll also notice, if you have incredible eyes, that it's signed by Henry Kendall. And so this was the continuation of the White Mountain trips that BJ talked about to the Sierra, going up there with experimentalists. And I have to think that, you know, some of the physics in here was discussed, well, maybe not right then, but on the drive up and the drive back. Absolutely, yeah. So now comes the audience participation part of the talk, where everybody who is in this picture gets to raise their hand. So that Tom Applequist, you're looking for your glasses, but you're in the picture, so you have to raise your hand. And, oh, Marty's in there too, because I knew Bob was in there. So we have Bob Jaffe and Marty Einhorn. Anybody else? So I also know Mike Kreutz was in the picture because I found it on his web page. And Mike Kreutz always had a beard, but I'm still not sure which one he is. And there's Sid, and Tung Mo Yan is in the picture. Somebody said next to Sid, but I'm not quite sure. Okay, good. So it turns out every 22 years there's a picture of the SLAC theory group, roughly, that you can find on the web. Okay, but now we're past 1969. There are quarks. People are starting to believe that quarks are pretty real. You can see them in deep inelastic scattering. And Glenis Farrar writes a couple papers with Stan Brodsky, which says that you can also understand the structure of not deep inelastic processes, but exclusive hadronic processes. SLAC is a lepton lab. There are no leptons in this process, so perfectly allowed. Anyway, so they understood the counting rules for exactly how these processes should scale according to QCD. That also led to a more quantitative picture, which is a paper by Brodsky and Lepage that came along a little bit later. And then this is a paper by Helen Quinn and Roberto Pache, which has been incredibly influential. I'm probably cheating a little bit because it says Institute of Theoretical Physics at Stanford, but Helen has been such a long time member of the SLAC theory group, and I think she's BJ's academic granddaughter, since she's Sid's academic granddaughter, because BJ was her advisor and is thanked in this paper. But anyway, in this paper, they give, to this date, the most compelling explanation of why the electric dipole moment of the neutron is so incredibly tiny compared to sort of the natural size you would have guessed. And that explanation leads to a new light weakly coupled particle in a leading dark matter candidate called the axion, or the invisible axion. So that's another really important paper that came out of the SLAC theory group. Now this paper I put in for maybe personal reasons. This was written by Toru Iguchi, who was a postdoc at SLAC, and also between SLAC and Chicago when he wrote it with Gilkey and Hansen. I like it because I learned something about differential geometry from it. And I also, Hansen was a postdoc too, okay. And I also learned that an accelerator lab could be interested in more esoteric, mathematical, and formal topics when I was thinking about where to go as a postdoc. And of course, who could leave out, even though it was already mentioned, that the SLAC theory group was the place where inflation was born, as we heard from Alan Guth's talk earlier today. And now at this point, I should mention the work of the conference organizer, which really laid out the way in which discussions of new physics in the context of precision electroweak measurements would be made for many decades since. This was done by Michael and Tatsu Takeuchi, and was incredibly influential. And then, like Sid, the guy wrote a pretty good textbook too. He doesn't have quite the blurb writers that Bob Jaffe has, however. He got BJ, who said, "I fear for my royalties." Okay, so it's 22 years later. As I promised, there's another picture of the SLAC theory group. So anybody in the audience who is there in 92, wave your hand. Great. Anybody? I saw Andre earlier, but anyway, Howie's there. Howie's a mainstay. And so you can see BJ in the back, too. And Sharon Jensen is in the picture again. I forgot to point out Sharon earlier. And Pierre was also in the earlier picture. And Mike Dines was in the audience, but he might have. So anyway, most of these people are now professors of physics somewhere. Maybe 50% of the people who weren't already professors. And Patrick Huet, over there on the right, was in high tech for a while, but he recently went into teaching high school physics. But Patrick wanted me to say how the reason he's in this country is because of Sid. So Sid was, in addition to getting the Babar coil over in time, he also worked on a lot of visa issues thanks to his connections. And I know at least 2 people in the theory group who are in this country still because of his efforts. Now we're moving on to the turn of the millennium. And this is a classic paper that had involvement from the SLAC theory group. And in fact, it's a breakthrough. You can see because it says breakthrough over there. And for those of you who don't know Nima, he doesn't always dress this way. In any event, in this paper, they argued that there might be a totally different solution to the hierarchy problem than people had thought about before. We heard a little from Anne about warped extra dimensions and the Randall-Sundrum model, but a little bit before that, if I remember right, was, so this is 98, was sort of large circular wrapped extra dimensions, and the prospects for explaining the hierarchy problem in this way, which led to a number of not only collider observables, but also measurements of fifth force type things. So this influenced an awful lot of experimental activity in the years to come. So since I paid off the conference organizer, this is my chance to toot my own horn and say that I had moved into perturbative QCD, and I was working with somebody who was also in this picture. We let anybody who shows up on this day get in the picture. That's Svi Byrne to my left. And he and I and David Kossauer and Dave Dunbar have been bringing in some kinds of ingredients from string theory and mixing them up, and S-matrix unitarity from the 60s, and mixing them up with basic perturbation theory in order to try to make a new way of doing the kinds of calculations that you needed for the LHC. And it also turned out to work really well in other kinds of theories too, like supergravity. So we were having a lot of fun doing unitarity and taking cuts of amplitudes to break them up into pieces and make them simpler to calculate. And then a couple of postdocs decided this method works so well, why not do it backwards? So they took amplitudes that they wanted to make cross-sections out of, like to produce the Higgs boson, shown here, and along with a few gluons at higher orders, they took and glued those back together so that they looked sort of like amplitudes. And that turned out to be really useful and let them calculate things a lot better. So that was Babis Anastasiou on the left and Kirill Melnikov, and they're both professors in Zurich and in Karlsruhe. But the last but not least, in fact, best, is the so-called best paper by B.J., Reuven Essig, Philip Schuster, and Natalia Toro. And they were thinking a lot about issues like G-2, I think, and dark matter, of course. And they sort of decided that there are many fixed target approaches to search for dark matter in the laboratory. And now Philip and Natalia have come back as professors in the SLAC theory group, and they're continuing that and designing new kinds of experiments and still staying very closely coupled to experiment. And this is all part of the tradition that Sid enabled. So here we are a few years ago, but about 22 years after the last picture that I could find. And that's the theory group in 2014. And we're not on the steps of what used to be called Central Lab anymore. We're on the steps of Kaipak, which is right across the walkway from our new home, or now 10 years old home in the ROB, or 7 years old home. And a lot of the open door policy we had even extended to windows. This was the old fishbowl, and we have a new fishbowl that doesn't have as many windows in it. Speaking of those long seminars, I mean, Michael alluded briefly to my job talk, I think in the fall of 1985, but it was total anarchy. At the end of it, it was basically Michael trying to explain my talk to Lenny Susskind, and Lenny Susskind trying to explain it back to Michael. So I went home over Christmas break, and I started to count, where are the other places I might get a job? So anyway, I don't know what happened, but somehow I got an offer here. And another thing was that Helen used to always joke, say to the speaker, when the speaker said, "How much time do I have left?" because of all the questions, she would explain that you have an hour and we have as long as we want. And we were supposed to get a chess clock, but we never did, to keep track of the respective time. And I've been running pretty fast, so I can slow down for a second. I have to unveil some deep, dark secret now, which is Sid was a great theorist, but he was also a very busy man at the time I knew him, doing lots of stuff in Washington, always getting phone calls. And he'd been to Washington, so he'd learned a few diplomatic skills. And so I noticed that he always sat at the door during the theory seminars. And very regularly, he would get a note from Bonnie Rose. And, about half the time, he would read the note, and he would get up and go take a phone call or something. And the other half the time, he would crumple up the note. But I began to notice that whether he crumpled the note up or went to take the call correlated with the quality of the seminar. And so I began to suspect that maybe this wasn't just a phone call. Maybe it was a secret coded signal. And so anyway, I've confirmed this with a senior senior source in the administration, and I can't say any more than that. But the place that these seminars took place in the old days was the green room. I don't know why it's called that. There wasn't much that was green in it. But here you can see it was also, the original chairs were green. Yeah, that's right. Before these, there were those green chairs, even when I got there. It's kind of drab olive, but okay. Anyway, this is not a formal seminar, but it was the best picture I could find. It says that SLAC theorists discuss methods for analyzing the production of supersymmetric particles at the LHC in 2008, back when people still hoped to find supersymmetric particles at the LHC. So, well, it may still happen, but it's going to be tricky, going to be tough. So now I'll turn to even lighter fare than we've already had and discuss softball with the experimenters. And this brings back memories. I'm not sure that this might be Brian Lynn on the far left. Yeah, and this is Joe Ballum from the research division, as it was called back then. Joel Polchinski, who has had a stellar career in string theory at Austin, Texas, and Santa Barbara. Howie Haber, who's over there from Santa Cruz, and was our starting shortstop. Sid, pitcher. Benny Ward also played infield somewhere. And there's Sid and Bert on the right with the famous Drell Richter trophy. Second only importance to the Drell-Yan mechanism. And here's another picture that was taken from 1997. If you see a tall guy in the back waving a bunch of quarks around, it's probably BJ, so I think that's him back there. Anyway, there are a lot of other people in that picture, but I really enjoyed that game because we actually won incredibly for the 5th time in 9 years. We probably never won again after that. But it was a famous game because the Consulate General of Switzerland wrote to Stan Brodsky to describe how our team should have theoretically lost, but the well-elaborated game plan that Stan worked out, apparently, allowed him and his team to win this prestigious game. He hoped that next year's result would again be positive. It wasn't. But most years, the highlight was not the game, but the party afterwards at Sid and Harriet's house. And there's the backyard to the famous house on Alvarado Row. If I had included a little more in the picture, you could probably see the tower where BJ was in voluntary confinement when Bjorkane and Drell was written. And of course, people enjoyed a little post-game festivities, including Maxime Perlstein on the right, who went on to a nice career at Cornell afterwards. But there's Sid and Harriet leading the post-game party. So I wanted to conclude with another quote. This was from Shimon Yankielewicz. He recalled the conversation soon after he arrived at SLAC. He, with a little temerity, went into Sid's office and said that he thought maybe there was a mistake of some factor in the formula in his book. Sid said, "Say no more, I'll assume you're right, and this is the only mistake in the book. How much did you pay for the book in Israel?" And Shimon wasn't sure, he didn't remember, so Sid pulls out of his pocket a quarter and says, "I think this will compensate you for buying a defective goods, a book which carries one mistake. It's roughly the royalty I get for each book." So we'll conclude at the beginning. These were some of the qualities that Sid really imbued the SLAC theory group with, and he basically found the formula for outstanding theoretical physics for a half century. So thank you very much.
The hours, oh, you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, maybe Tom Appelquist will bear me out, but your comment about Sid's strategy in the seminar was observed already in 1969.
And not even by
68 and 69.
Okay, I was late to the game. Sorry.
Well, let's thank again all the speakers at this symposium. It's been a great day.